Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you're new to our webinars, every month we aim to bring you live, engaging webinars to answer your questions about medical and regulatory writing, processes, scientific communications, and so much more. So let me welcome you to our very special series of IVDR webinars that we have lined up just for you. Today's topic is leveraging the MDR experience for IVDR, tips for successful performance evaluation, and PMS, PMPF processes. Next month, we'll follow this webinar with two more. The first one will be sort of a hidden traps that you should be looking out for PER preparedness. And the second one will be a deep dive into the state-of-the-art section on PERs with the intent to help you with your IVDR readiness. More information on registering for this whole series will be emailed to you after this webinar. Our speakers today are Criterion Edge's President, Laurie Mitchell, and we have a very special guest today with us, Byrd, the VP of Regulatory Quality and Clinical for Nextern. Laurie is the founder and president of Criterion Edge, a global medical and regulatory writing and safety services firm serving the medical device, pharmaceutical, and biotech industries. Laurie has over 20 years of experience in medical writing, safety and pharmacovigilance management, and regulatory reporting. Having provided regulatory and medical writing solutions to many pharma and medical device companies, both large and small, she is a proven leader in designing practical strategies to meet current global regulatory challenges. Laurie is also a published author and holds a Master of Nursing from UCLA. Carolyn is a VP of Regulatory Quality and Clinical for Nextern Innovation and has over 20 years of medical device experience in quality, regulatory, R&D, and operations. For the last 6+ years at Leica Biosystems and Abbott, Carolyn has stood up strategies and programs to enable implementation of MedDev 2.7/1 Rep 4 and the EU MDR and IVDR. In her role at Nextern, she's a part of the executive team enabling realization of medical device innovations with valued collaborators at every stage of a device's life cycle for any part of the world where patients are in need. Before we begin, I want to mention a few housekeeping items. If anyone in our audience is experiencing technical difficulties, you can use the chat option on your Zoom menu bar. Send us a message and we'll do our best to resolve it for you. If you have any questions about any content that's being discussed today, you don't have to wait until the end. There's a Q&A option on your Zoom menu bar. Go ahead and type in your questions at any point in time, and we will run through as many of them as we can. We have some time carved out at the very end of the webinar to specifically answer your questions. And if we don't get to your question, we'll get in touch with you afterwards. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on the website afterwards. You'll also get an email with a link to the recording as well as the slides. Lastly, I want to encourage all our attendees to just hang on for a little bit more after we finish our webinar today for a very short 2-question survey. The feedback really helps us in making content that's important for you. So Carolyn and Laurie will be discussing today and sharing these key lessons learned from their years of experience supporting medical device manufacturers in the transition from MDD to MDR and current IVD companies' transition to IVDR compliance. How can the insights gained from the MDR experience support and inform IVD companies as they transition to IVDR? The key takeaways from the discussion today are below. Early implementation of structural process change across the organization can empower future success with IVDR submissions to the notified bodies. What are the key documents and processes essential for successful alignment with IVDR regulations? The importance of understanding the critical role of proactive and ongoing systematic literature review, search, and screening activities, as well as some unexpected roadblocks. With that, Laurie, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jessica. Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining. And Caroline is indeed a special guest today, so we look forward to a spirited discussion that we hope will be useful to you. In today's discussion, Caroline and I thought that we would concentrate and rotate around some of these themes that you see here on the screen, how we can apply or how we can discuss applying MDR lessons learned to the IVDR space, to compare and contrast the processes and the documents in those two spaces and how The lessons learned from MDR might help you prepare your processes and documents in the IVD space. We want to linger on thoughts about systematic literature reviews, which we know there are a lot of questions about, and also other critical resources that you may be thinking about or maybe haven't thought about as you prepare and get ready with compliance to IVDR. Next slide, Jessica. Caroline, take it away. This is something that is near and dear to you, so take away
yeah,
here.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I definitely want to keep this light and conversational and not a reiteration of regulation by any means, because I'm sure all of you listening have read it and read it and read it. Like Dr. Akra says, you know, and you read it again and you learn something new every time you read it. So let's talk about kind of, you know, Laurie, we've been on this journey together since 2016, at least, when the MedDev 271 Red 4 came out. And
we were, yes.
Right. And med devices, we were like, let's figure out how we're going to piece all this together for clinical evaluation.
And it's very true, Caroline, that what we thought then isn't where we landed in 2018 or 2019 or even today.
Yeah, exactly.
So maybe one of the lessons is that this is an iterative process.
It totally is.
What you think you know now isn't necessarily what's going to be true in a year from now.
No, exactly right. And so, you know, we struggled with it even when the clinical evaluation guidance came out. Then the MDR dropped on top of that at the same time as the IVDR, right? And so med device was already on this journey of trying to figure out how to piece together the clinical story and tie it over to post-market surveillance requirements and get this whole life cycle loop happening. You know, so then when the IVDR hit and the requirements became very clear, what those expectations were clearer, we really focused on that. And IVD companies were sort of like, we got a little time here. Let's take some more time and figure this out. Meanwhile, MDR is, you know, chugging away and these med device companies are jumping right on it. So I'm hoping you know, in this conversation, we can convey some of those learnings along the way where we started in med device, got into the IVD space, and that's really where the bulk of the work is right now, I think, is a lot of work to happen in a really short time to get to this May 2022 deadline, because so many things are being upclassified under the IVDR that require this amount of rigor now that these companies have never faced before. So that's what I'm hoping to share, some of these watch outs or ahas, just my own personal experience going from company to company and program to program, technology to technology, trying to work this out. So if we start with the MDR and IVDR, all things start with planning. So they're just called different names, but it's the same principle here. We've got clinical evaluation planning and performance evaluation planning. And within this whole planning structure, this is where if you're transitioning a device, you're kind of looking backwards and reflecting on how would I have written a plan for this product if I had started it from scratch. If you're starting a product from scratch, this is where you sit down with a blank piece of paper and how are we going to divide and conquer this thing? How are we going to approach it? This is where the planning piece just helps the team come together and wrap their brains around what do we know, what we do not know, and where are we going to hone in on our learnings? What questions do we still have left to answer that will help drive us through the rest of our design and development decisions? So this planning process is really important to gel the team, come together. This is where you're scoping out what are the similar devices, what claims are we going to go after, what is the state of the art looking like, what questions do we need to answer to help position our product in the clinical space as a whole. All of these questions pop up when you're doing the planning. And in that, then part of this becomes then feeding into your systematic literature search plan as well. So I have seen this done both ways, where it's buried within the PER plan or the PEP or the CEP, or it can be separated. But it's the thought process that's important. So all that planning about how you're going to approach the process, and then specifically how you're going to execute on the literature search, that's important. That's the same. We get into execution though, that's where stuff gets a little different. Both processes, both regulations require some sort of state-of-the-art statement. We have to be able to say we're new and novel and there's no one out there, no other thing like us, or there's several other iterations or types of devices on the market, and here's how we play together in that space. So just again, starting to tell that story and make sure it's supported by data and evidence. And then the PER execution has some specific reports that need to be conducted to feed into this overarching wrapper of a report that becomes the PER. Same thing with the clinical evaluation report on the MDR side. We're looking at preclinical work, clinical studies, not so much specifically like the PER requires inputs, but just taking what we have and again, doing a summary around it and telling our story, resulting in the report. And then these reports then come back together process-wise into the post-market surveillance space. And that's the next little arrow over. There we go. So post-market surveillance space. Now we come back together again, basically with the same exact elements, but just named differently. So for the MDR, we have post-market surveillance plan, post-market clinical follow-up plans and reports, and then where applicable, when you have the higher classification devices, the product safety update report and the summary of safety and clinical performance report. The IVDR requires basically the same concepts. They just call them performance reports instead of clinical performance reports. So, you know, a lot of people have really struggled with, where do I even start? How do these things come together? Especially when it's hard when you're transitioning a device. Do you start with post-market surveillance and work your way back up into the plan? And I hate to tell you that there's no exact right or wrong way to do it. Just start doing it. I think is what you got to do. These deliverables are so intertwined. The important part is telling the story, and pick a place to start that story. You're going to come up with questions that then need to be answered from either an input or placed in an output. And then this series of documentation is all going to get compiled together and fit in the end. That's the most important piece, so that you can tell your story beginning to end to the notified bodies or the competent authorities that are going to be reviewing this on the backside.
Caroline, I want to jump in and say that you're really resonating with a medical writer here. You know, Criterion Edge, we're a medical writing and regulatory writing company, and we've written many dozens of MDR CERs, many that have gone you know, across very successfully to the notified bodies. And when it really resonates with me when you talk about telling the story, and I know that there might be questions about this with the you know, in our Q&A session at the end, is that telling the story, and to us, the story starts with the state of the art. And I think that will be the same I think that is the same in the IVD space, is that there's a scientific validity report, but that's part of the overall story of state of the art. And that's a very, as you said, intertwined and a very specific story to tell, sort of starting broadly and then moving down to starting broadly with your device's epidemiology and what it treats or what it measures, patient populations, the indications, and then as you move down the funnel, you're talking about the conditions or medical conditions or the therapeutic areas that it touches, and then you move into the narrowest part of the state-of-the-art funnel, which is where you're talking about your device versus its competitors. And that's where you land. That's where really the meat starts happening in the science, in the state of the art, is that here is where you're talking about your device as compared to its competitors. So you're not comparing your device to the greatest, most sexy device that's out there that does something similar to your device. You're comparing your device to its peers, technologically, clinically, if they're IFUs. So you have a narrow, I always kind of call it like the frosting on the cake, or like a layer. Your device exists in a layer where there are other devices like it. Those are what you compare it to, and those are the competitors. And against those data is what you establish your device's performance and safety.
Yeah.
So I really liked your idea about telling the story, because the whole PER is a story. And the other thing I like to say is you start pulling out threads, the story starts caving in. So it's very, very interrelated.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about the IVD space is the intended purpose statement requirements in the IVDR are very, very explicit. And so that's where I think a lot of IVD manufacturers has struggled with some of this process in comparison to the medical device industry. Medical device industry, you have a little more flexibility, I would say, to place words appropriately to convey what the intended purpose is. It's a little more of a free form under the regulation I'm speaking of, little free form. Under the IVDR, it's explicit that your intended purpose statement has a series of sub-bullets that it must tackle, or in your technical file, you need to justify why you are not going to make a precision claim or something like that. Why does it not apply to this device specifically? So it is pretty formulaic how I think the competent authorities are looking for you to explain your device. And then within that, your scientific validity report and your analytical performance report directly support words that you've placed now in that intended purpose statement. So I guess my point is, I think the notified bodies and the regulators are definitely looking for explicit ties between the way in which you say this is how my product is intended to perform, and here's where it is, maybe in a panel of other diagnostic devices. This is where it plays, and make sure you're really crystal clear on, I'm saying my intended purpose is this because of how it fits in this broader clinical continuum. And then here's my analytical performance report to support these claims. And here's my SVR that supports how I've positioned it within the state of the art.
Great, great. Hey, Jessica, maybe we can roll to the next slide now and talk a little bit more about those documents.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think this slide probably doesn't come as much of a surprise to folks. There are the PER and the CER, the two center reports have many feeder reports, as Caroline has talked about. The inputs coming from the IFU, or the intended purpose statement, really in the IVDR, risk, technical testing in the IVDR space. They're the PMPF plans and the PMS plans, and of course the PEP itself, and then all the post-market data that feeds into the PER. All of those are very similar on the MDR. They're almost identical, really. You have post-market data, your clinical data sources, and your technical data sources or non-clinical data sources are important feeders into the each of these central documents. But of course, in the IVD space, there is a unique set of reports, freestanding reports, that feed into the IVD, into the PER. And that's, of course, the scientific validity, the analytical performance, and the clinical performance reports. Those do not have an equivalent in the medical device space. So we feel, Caroline and I have fielded, and you probably have questions about, and Caroline, let's talk about this, is that there are questions already that I've seen coming in from other webinars about what do we as an IVD company do with these SVRs, this SVR, APR, and CPR. I think everyone's pretty clear they need to develop it, but I think there is a lack of clarity sometimes on how do they talk to or relate to the PER. And we've gotten questions that all the way range from, do we take these 3 reports, bolt them together, put a little piece at the front introducing them and a little piece at the end that says, here you go, this is what you just read, and that's our PER. We have gotten questions like that, all the way to you know, asking for verification if the PER is to look much like the CER does. And the answer is, from Caroline's and mine's experience and understanding, is that it looks like the MDR, like the MDR CER. This is not about taking 3 freestanding reports and telling the notified body and wrapping it kind of up in a bow in a single document and telling the notified body, here you go, this is what you are going to read. Let us know if you have any questions. It is a completely freestanding story to tell in the PER, of which the data and the information from those reports and all of those other inputs come together in a unique story and a unique freestanding analysis of all of these inputs to arrive at one conclusion. It's just like in the CER. The CER, I always say in my other webinars, the CER has one job to do, only one. And the PER, it's the same way. The CER and the PER must demonstrate the safety and performance of the subject device or devices that are under evaluation. That's what it has to do. And that's what the notified body is going to be reading for. Caroline, you have any thoughts on that?
No, I completely agree with you. That's the hard part about like the PER in particular and these feeder documents. Typically the scientific validity report is written by a totally different group of people organizationally and skill set wise to set up here's the clinical space we're operating in and write that report, versus the APR, which are maybe your scientists or your engineers who develop the device and know exactly all the technical specifications that need to be tested and vetted and recorded. So it's the challenge with a PER or CER is, how do you take all these various authored documents and digest them and summarize them in a way that's meaningful for an outsider to review that and put it all together in a story that the notified body or anybody else could read and follow. So it's definitely not intended to be a copy paste out of other reports and say, see, I did all my work and we're fine. It's not that at all. And you can't just also have the PER or CER written in a way that completely ignores or doesn't reference all these other, so you got to find the balance here to say, here's my methodology that I've used when approaching this whole thing. We did this kind of analysis, see this report over here, but the result of that says this to us. Then we did this analysis and the result of that report over there tells us this. And in the end, we're able to make that singular conclusion.
In the end, we make those overall global conclusions. So yes, the PER will starts with the state-of-the-art / the scientific validity, that sets up the whole story for the rest of the PER, just as it does in the CER. It level sets and puts your subject device or devices, if it's a product family, puts them in space and time. It's like, here we are, here's who we are comparing to, and this is why. And why is it important to understand who the comparators are? It's because there's this little thing called safety and performance objectives, GSPRs, that must then be gleaned, the acceptance criteria must be gleaned from competitor device data so that you can choose your performance and safety objectives for your device and then pull data for acceptance criteria, for lower and upper bounds of safety and performance from competitors. It's no fair comparing your own data to yourself. You have to pull it from your competitors. And then you've now established a table essentially of acceptance criteria, high and low, for each one of those performance and safety objectives. And then going forward in the PER, you're going to look at your clinical data, your technical data, everything, PMS, post-market data, and you're going to look at those data through the lens of what you just told everybody and established in the state-of-the-art section. That's the general gist.
Yep.
And at the end, you're going to look at your risks, and you're going to put everything with risk into context, and then you're going to conclude. And you're going to analyze as you go across, as Caroline said earlier.
And, you know, the tricky part about this is the notified bodies. You know, there's tons of questions always come through about how much can I just combine together? Can I just write one big report that has all this stuff and write one big plan that has all this stuff? And I can tell you the notified bodies are going to, they can't consult. So you're going to have some interactions with them that are like, we have to.
They're frustrating.
Yeah, well, you gotta, it's a trick to work with them. You gotta read between the lines of what they're telling you. They're reiterating to you the requirements of the regulation. Like, I have to be able to find something called an analytical performance report in what you give me, and however you point to that, if it is in the PER subsection 7.2.5 resides the APR, you could do that, or you could just make it a standalone document. And then when you're filling in your notified bodies checklist, or you're structuring your technical file for submission, it's really easy to say, this document number is my PER. This document number is my CPR. This document number is whatever. And then as they're reading through the PER, it's very easy to cross-reference over to these other feeders and deliverables.
Yeah, and I want to point out here too, Caroline, when you're making that point, is that remember that the SVR, the APR, and the CPR predate the PER. You haven't, remember what I just talked about when I said that in the state of the art, and I'm talking not to you, Caroline, but to everybody.
Yep.
In the state of the art section, and that's where you are establishing those safety and performance objectives, and de novo for the first time, essentially, they're seen in the PER. You're going to see those acceptance criteria because you've done a very extensive systematic literature review, which we're going to talk about next. And you have extracted those data and those data and put them in the state of the art for the first time. That's where they exist. So whatever you pre-wrote in your SVR, APR, and CPR, at the end of the day, doesn't have that kind of structure. It's more, here's what we found, but now we have to take those findings and then put them in the context. That's what we keep saying, the context of the PER. And that context is those safety and performance objectives and acceptance criteria measurements. So that's my thought there.
Yeah, no, well, and I think what happens is, though, everyone's struggling to meet a deadline and get all of these documents and requirements cranked through. And you know what? This device has been on the market for 40 years. Everyone knows this device. Come on, can't I consolidate all these documents? Why do I have to write this all over the place? And I think you're totally right. The challenge is taking these legacy devices that have been around for a long time and kind of reverse engineering it. And really, that's what I've said for many years now, is the MDR and IVDR. It's like you're resubmitting your device all over again. And really the notified bodies are looking at it like that, like, prove to me why this thing that was maybe a diagnostic for AIDS or HIV detection developed in the early 80s, how come that's state of the art today? What is that diagnostic pathway today? It could be completely different. And that is the whole trick and challenge to all this. is to act as if it is a new device and piece it all out. And then when you get to the post-market pieces, they are looking for a separated post-market surveillance plan. Now, you can in that plan justify why you don't need a post-market clinical follow-up report or a post-market performance follow-up report, but I would really talk to your notified body on that topic in particular. That one has been really contentious, I would say, throughout the regulations implementation, because the working groups that are coming out with all the guidance documents to support implementation of the regulation through MDCG and everything, they're coming up with templates for PMCF plans and reports. And so there's this weird gray space without that guidance out there that explicitly now says, I expect this to be a separated document that minimally contains all these things. People have been getting away with justifying it or placing it as a subsection within the PMS plan,
Right.
And report overall. So I don't know. Some of this stuff, it's like the notified bodies, you'll get the hint right away. I need to check my box that you have all these things. You better have a specific reference for me. And then other things like the PMCF and PMPF plan, it's a little more gushy until those guidances come out.
MDR too. Well, let's
Yeah.
jump to our next topic on
Yeah.
which I think is systematic literature reviews. I can speak to this is because Criterion Edge certainly has an entire team that does systematic literature reviews in support of all kinds of initiatives, primarily CERs. And it's a big and an iterative process. And I would just like to say you should focus early on it. It is a rigorous process, and it's mandated by IVDR. This is not, and I've put on whole webinars about this, which is, kind of driving home the point. This is a methodologically robust, well-described process that the notified bodies pay a lot of attention to. They do. Why do they pay a lot of attention to it? Because this is essentially where you are deriving data, both either on your competitors or you're extracting or identifying and extracting data either on your competitors to help establish those bars of acceptance criteria. And then going forward in the CER, in the PER, you are extracting data on your own device. So data is important. That is the underpinning of the entire argument. What does your data say? So if the notified bodies believe that you have taken shortcuts on your methodology, if there's a hint that of any kind of bias, it's like, well, and here's some, Caroline and I have stories about this, about notified bodies, feedback, or when we're talking to clients, or I'm talking to clients that are trying to do IVDR, and they say, well, we did a search. Where did you do the search? PubMed, on the internet. It's not going to work. It doesn't pass muster, ever. It's because it's not reproducible and it's not robust. In other words, one of the notified bodies' first bars is that if they ask themselves, if I sat down and I looked at this search strategy or this, whatever they're describing as their search strategy, and I did it exactly as they are telling me I did it, will I get the same results they did or nearly the same? And if the answer is, and the answer always with an internet search is no, you will not ever. So that's one, the reproducibility and the transparency. And the other thing that makes them very nervous is when there's any kind of hint of, I'll say, cherry picking or bias. The bias thing, the whole thing about, well, we did a search. We got back, we got back 250 references. Our device is 25 years old. So we only went back the last couple of years and we still got, a couple of hundred. So we just picked the top 40 that we like. Well, this is not a radio station. We can't pick the top 40. It has to be, human eyeballs have to look at all of those search results. So these are kind of the things that we want to talk about. So I'll just walk really quickly through this. is
Yeah.
that it's, you start with a search strategy, which is using mesh terminology on a robust platform, such as we use ProQuest Dialog, which is a platform in which, and we have a librarian who knows how to build these complex search syntax and search protocols. It's queued up for our platform, ProQuest Dialog. Embase and Medline are the two databases that are searched, which is fine with MDR and IVDR. And then you must screen human eyeballs, as I always say, must screen all results for inclusion and exclusion. They must. And you have to describe exactly how you did that and exactly what you excluded and why. And you have to make tables for that. They have to be able to look at every piece. And then for the included articles, then human eyeballs dig into those included articles to extract data, and then weight and appraise that data. And then those data are put in tabular formats across the PER, and then they're analyzed back against those state-of-the-art established performance and safety criteria. That's the process. And it can't be, the other thing that I tend to say to folks when they ask is that, here's my sort of standard response. Notified body reviewers are tired, cranky, hungry, distracted, overworked, all of these things. So they're going to go to some low-hanging fruit in a CER, a PER, and that one of the low-hanging fruits is this methodology. They're going to go right to it. In our experience, we work for other companies. We do not submit directly to a notified body. Our clients do, but we see all those regulatory responses that come back, or we're engaged to help fix the regulatory responses that came back more commonly. And a lot of it surrounds, if there's issues with searching, they will question all the downstream data. So, and you're sort of dead in the water. If they're questioning your data, you don't have much of a leg to stand.
Well, and Laurie, this is super important for the IVD space, because you remember, like 80% or some crazy number of diagnostics were previously all self-declared devices, and they don't have clinical studies. So this is the thing that is going to,
money shot.
This is the thing that's going to save you to keep those products in context, supported with some kind of data, is a thoroughly robust literature review. And do not shortchange this. And also don't underestimate the work that goes into it. A lot of people think, well, I'll just do a Google search. And when I'm designing and developing something, I'm a scientist. I do these things all the time. I can do it in 4 hours. That's not this. There's the state-of-the-art search, and then there's the competitive device, and then there's your own device. And there's a lot of data and review that needs to be done, and summaries that need to be created. And you can't just cherry pick the ones that support what you want to say about your device and ignore the fact that, hey, other people have had problems with this, we could too, or maybe we don't, and we need to head that off at the pass again with our analysis to say we don't have that problem that this other thing had because we're different in this way.
Right.
So like this of all things is really, really important to get solid and not skimp on. And don't underestimate how much it takes.
Don't underestimate it. And speaking of underestimating, let's go to our last slide, which will wrap up really quickly. And then we'll open it up for questions. I know some questions are coming in. And to Caroline's point that she was just making is that you can't underestimate anything. And do you have the right people dedicated to the project? Do they have the right skill sets for the job they are assigned? And then have you found, folks to help you fill in the gaps, either resources or tools, for example, that we were just talking about. So these are, and the other thing that I always say to folks as they're getting ready, even if you have all of these things here, do not underestimate the master of us all, which is time. Time is the master of us all. And if you do not build in enough time for this iterative process, especially as you're kind of piecing it together for the first time, then time will be your enemy. at the end. So I want to wrap up now. That's because I know the questions are flooding in. We've really only got 20 minutes to go. Jessica, I can hand this back to you.
Thank you, Laurie and Caroline, for this engaging discussion. It was so much fun to hear you guys talk about this. I want to remind our audience, you can continue to send us your questions. We already have a large number lined up, so we're ready to jump right into them. Information for contacting Caroline and Laurie are on this next slide. If you guys want to ask any questions post this webinar, you can reach out to them there. So as I'm setting up our whiteboard, the next thing you'll see is going to be a little question and answer section. Just give me a second to set that up and let me know when you're able to see that on your screen, both of you, Caroline and Laurie.
Sure.
Sure.
All right, so our first question, if you can see it.
Yep.
Okay, it's what is the best approach for legacy devices for performance evaluation? As per the IVDR, scientific validity is associated with the analyte, with clinical condition or physiological state. So based on this, is it necessary, is the scientific validity necessary for control products?
Caroline, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so no, it's a good question. You do need to have a scientific validity report. And I get where you're going with this. These control devices are like controls for across many different analytes. Like I'm lighting up this target in this cell for this reason. That's what the reagent does. And then the control checks to make sure, is this whole process functioning right? So I think in this case, maybe the scientific validity report is more like, why do we have controls? Why are they needed? What kinds of controls are needed in what situations? And how does that then?
And what is their function?
Yeah, like what is their, where?
A function. What are they supposed to do at the end of the day?
And I think that's all that this needs to be, is sort of positioning what is their function and where do they fit in the clinical space, and then so basically why do they exist? And so these reports don't have to be giant and long by any means, but just something that has the expert eyes has been put on it and provides that context that then could feed into the summary of your performance evaluation report. That's the best I'd say about that.
I would say that whether it's a control or a reagent or whatever it is, at the end of the day, that element, that device, if you will, or reagent, it has a job to do, and the PER is establishing, again, its safety and efficacy, safety and performance. So never lose track of what the job is of the PER, regardless of what the device is that's under evaluation. At the end of the day, you have to demonstrate that it's doing its job,
yep,
as described and as intended. So that is your overall, just, it doesn't have to be more complicated than that. That's what the PER is supposed to do. Now, how you go about it is you're looking at, those elements, you're telling that story, you're looking at the data, and you're demonstrating that it's doing it. So that's my 2 cents there. Next question there, Jessica.
Okay, the next question is, do you have to summarize every single analytical study performed in the APR?
So this has been
well, isn't the APR about a particular thing?
It is
about a thing. So
yeah.
if the thing has multiple components, you have to describe it, right?
Yeah, I guess what I was thinking about, I'm just trying to relate it back to like the MDR experiences we've had. I've had conversations with notified bodies about to what extent do you need to summarize all your preclinical work, for example, because you do a lot of iterative benchtop testing, perhaps in animal testing, as you're iterating your device early on. And the notified bodies are coming back saying, certain notified bodies come back and say, yep, I want to know basically the whole history of your device. And what did you experience throughout the design and development process? And even if those studies didn't work out, why didn't they work out? Why didn't they meet their inputs? What did you endpoints? What did you learn from that? And how did you then iterate your design to get you to that successful preclinical study that then enabled you to freeze your design to go into full clinical study?
In other words, where you started and how you got here.
Yeah, they want to see like the whole of your experience.
Design history.
So if you apply that kind of thinking to the APR that says, you know, I first launched this product 40 years ago and I did testing that said that it had this precision, but then we made XYZ changes or improvements. And then now I test it again and test it again and test it again over the course of decades, maybe. The question is, how far back do you have to go to summarize all of that and provide all the evidence with it? And so I think we got to find a balance. I guess I haven't exactly encountered this to this extent with a notified body yet, but for sure you have to have data that supports the claims you want to make today.
Right.
Like the most recent of everything, the freshest, best stuff, and summarize all of that and tie it back to your intended purpose statements, claims that or performance claims you're making about your device. Do you have to summarize and support everything for the last 40 years? I don't think so. I think your notified body, if you have a conversation with them, is probably going to say, just give me the last like 5 years.
Yeah.
Like, you know, just like in a post-market surveillance trend report, they're looking really for like a 5-year moving window. Typically, I think you'd be safe if you just went back there and said, yeah, this is a long market history wise. This thing is well proven. It's been on the market for 40, 50 years. But when we just look at the last 5 years of data, here's been our experience with this device, and here's where we're at today.
Good.
Okay. Next question. To write a state of the art, we need information about the competitor or benchmark devices. But if we don't have any previous generation or similar devices in the market, how can we address the state of the art of a particular product or device?
Well, so I'll
start
a little bit. First of all, I would say, but if we don't have any previous generation, so I'm going to take previous generation as meant to be previous generations of your own device, perhaps.
That's what I would interpret that to be.
So yeah. if that's what it's meant, you can't compare yourself to yourself. It's not, you are not, your previous generations of your own device are not considered a competitor of your own device. So we can, if that's what's meant there, we can set that aside. You can't compare yourself to yourself, even your past self. But similar devices on the market. This is where the state of the art becomes complex. Is that if there's not a one-to-one relationship, is that, you know, I'm a machine that measures, you know, hematology and a certain panel, and, you know, there's 50 competitors of that out on the market. We have that's easy. You choose your top 5 competitors or something like that. You don't have to choose every competitor, by the way. Mm-hmm. But when you have a unique device that employs technology in a certain way to come out with a certain outcome or test, you have to then, what are your competitors, you ask? Well, you have to parse into your technology. Mm-hmm. Is your technology that is deployed in a certain way to come out with something unique, does it have competitors? So now you're sort of looking at not the total device, but the pieces that make up the device and say, well, we depend on XYZ technology in this way to do what we want. So now in the state of the art, we'd be looking at the competitors for that XYZ technology or something like it.
Even if it's in a different clinical space, potentially. Correct.
Yeah. Because it's the technology itself. So right. I think the short answer, without belaboring it too much, is that sometimes you have to, you know, compare, like, just let's take a human face, for example. We're all unique, but we all have this, and we all have these, and we all have one of those. So that's the kind of parsing it out to say, well, I'm going to compare eyes. and I'm going to compare no's because our technology is unique, but it has common parts.
Yeah. And I would also add to this, I have seen situations where literally it's a breakthrough technology, and the only thing that's out there right now is maybe a pharmaceutical or, a physical therapy or something like that. And you are the first thing to come out here and totally break new ground on it. That also needs to be explained in the state of the art, because clinically, the state of the art right now is these patients follow this regimen and decision-making tree, and they land in the pharmaceutical pathway, and that's where all things end today. We're coming in here to disrupt that and say, now we can put a device there, or we can detect this thing differently. And then you jump into the technology comparison. Like we used to, now we're going to treat this symptom with zapping it with technology that normally you zap your foot. Now we're going to zap your ear with it. So again, it goes back to telling the story of the clinical space, where you fit in that clinical space, and then technologically, what can you learn? What can you draw some conclusions around?
Right. Good question.
Good one.
That's a good question. It's always a toughie.
Yep.
Yeah, I have another question here that I feel like you might have kind of touched on, Caroline. I'm not sure if you want to add anything further to it.
Sure.
Someone here is asking about advice for PER for devices that are in a category of their own, first of their kind. I know you sort of said something about it near the end.
Yeah, so let's see. Yeah, so the hard part about the new regulations is you can't directly compare yourself in every way to a competitor's device and say, yep, we're the exact same thing as them, because you don't have access to their technical documentation.
Yeah, and now you're talking about equivalence.
Yeah, so you don't know that, yes, you are exactly in every way exactly like this other device that is a gold standard owned by somebody else. But there's the IVD space is unique in this gold standard use. There's not an equivalent kind of thing. I can't think of one anyway, in the med device side of the world. So again, you go back to the scientific validity piece of things and the state of the art. And I think you have to just make a strong argument that this is how this industry or this clinical space works. This is what the standard of care, the clinical guidelines are in this space. And this is how we have demonstrated that we fall in line with that gold standard, or that we perform the same way in that gold standard. And you can demonstrate that depending on the aspect that's in question through your APR. Maybe you do have a scientific study or of some kind that was conducted to draw that conclusion, or maybe you're going to have to rely on literature that says, when I deploy this gold standard and I've compared it to these other diagnostics, they all perform equivalently or not, or whatever. Lots of different ways to tackle it, but I think the thinking through it is the important part. How are you going to make this? How do you want to position it? Yeah. And then how do you get the right data to support that?
The positioning of it.
Yeah.
So next question, Jessica, what have we got next?
Yeah. The next question, if the PEP contains relevant information which the PER requires, is it acceptable to cross-reference, not to repeat the info?
Easy answer. No. No.
Yeah, so you have to remember your audience.
The PER isn't right. Remember that tired, cranky, hungry guy or woman?
Yeah.
These PERs, just like the CER, are meant to be somewhat self-contained. Now, obviously, if there's a very large file that that was referenced maybe in an appendix, yes, you can make those kinds of references in the appendix to say, if they want way more information or see all the details, we can pull that file for you. But the story remains, this has to be integrated in the PER itself. In other words, you can't get partway through the story and say, ooh, the best part's coming up. Go
over here.
Go get this other book and read about the best part over here. And then after you've done that, we'll pick up from there and we'll keep telling our story. It doesn't work that way. So the
And
answer is no.
yeah, and in your PER, you want it all to be nicely self-contained. So ideally, the reader can see everything that they need to make it to agree with your conclusion, without having to go dig and dig and dig through all
They
your
don't
other supporting
require
data.
things. They do not want to dig and put the puzzle together themselves. They want you to tell the story and put it. If they have questions, they'll ask you, but it's your job to tell the story completely and plug all those holes inside the document.
The other thing to keep in mind is in different notified bodies all work different ways. And when you submit your technical documentation package as a whole, they will take it and split it up against multiple different technical reviewers sometimes with who have different expertise. And the PER is typically one of those things that get peeled away. And if you've got references back to V&V and risk management files all over the place, and you have to literally go read those documents to come to that same conclusion because you haven't summarized it well in your PER, it makes for a really long, messy review, and it really gets hung up in the notified body. So just another warning on that, like logistics front. Keep your audience in mind when you're creating your technical documentation.
And I'll just finish as we move to the next question. I'll finish with one more thought. Do you really want a reviewer to go into large documents where they're given carte blanche to look at whatever they want? This is like an audit.
Yeah.
So you need to tell them contain your story within a document, a few documents, not just say, well, that's explained over here in this 500-page document. Here it is. And then once you give it to them, they can read whatever they want. So no, you tell the story and respond with questions. But I think we have time, maybe Jessica, for one or two more questions if we make the answers brief.
Yeah, I got a question here that says, is a PMPF plan report always required, or are there exemptions?
Yeah, this is the one I was saying
I would like to say one thing about that is that in the MDR space, when things were very new, remember, Caroline, it was like we were getting away, or our clients were getting away with saying, we've got a PMCF plan under development. Remember that in 2017 and 2018, we're thinking about it. We'll get back to you. And the notified bodies let that slide. By 2019, they weren't letting that slide anymore. They just weren't. You had to have a plan. You don't get to say, I'll get back to you on that. But in the very early days of MDR, that worked. I honestly don't think again, this is a great question because leveraging MDR experience, I think the notified bodies are thinking, look, IVD companies, you've known about this for a long time. You're aware of what's happening over in MDR about PMCF data. You're going to have to plan for this. It's not going away because the medical device companies, like remember, Caroline, they freaked out because with this. What do you mean? We have to put on all these clinical trials in the post-market space? What the heck? And so that's narrowing. I don't think the IVD companies are going to get as big of a pass on that as and I just want to remind everybody what PMPF stands for. Post-market performance. And built into that is that it's proactive.
Yes.
I tell you how many times in CERs that we've fixed in the past that the client believes that their PMS data is post-market performance data. It's not, because PMS data comes into the company passively. You do not proactively plan for that, nor do you proactively seek it to answer questions about the safety and performance of your device ongoing in the post-market environment. It must be planned, it must be deliberate, it must be well described.
Couldn't agree more.
Now, one more.
Yeah, I wanted to actually share this one last question with you. I think it's very apt. Someone asked, I keep getting pushback from my team about the systematic review. They keep insisting that if the assay is well established, You don't need a full systematic review. Can you comment?
So
Yes, we can comment. That's not true.
yeah, so I have to be honest, I have seen this succeed so far one time where there was enough real world evidence and summary provided to provide confidence in the performance of the device, that the team got away with not doing the full systematic review. But I tend to caution that because the IVD people, the notified bodies just got designated, like in the last few months, as you recall, to actually review these things. And that might be acceptable today as they're starting out, but I'm telling you, as they see more and more different varying quality of work coming across their desk and things,
they hammer down on that.
they're going to start ratcheting this up. And so
the approach here, Caroline, I think the approach for companies that they might not be thinking about is that, all right, if you have a huge amount of clinical data sources available, clinical data in your clinical data sources on your device.
Oh yeah.
Then great.
Stand on that.
High quality problem, number one. But number two is, I don't believe that you should or even can or will be allowed to skip the step of doing a systematic literature review because you're proactively looking at published data out there right now in the published space. And if you skip that step, then how do we know, how does the notified body know that this is new information, that there aren't new risks being involved, that there aren't new AEs being involved? If they don't see you look, then they're going to wonder, how do you know what, if you don't look under these rocks, how do you know what's happening out there in the real world space? So I'll just finish my with this, is that you don't need to look back in a systematic literature review for a long time. Do a 5-year search, which I don't think they're going to take much less than 5, and scan it and do it. This is a high quality problem. Don't skip that step. And you have to do it for the state of the art and the competitor anyway. So it's just can't, don't try to wiggle around it. It's not, or do you really want to risk?
Yeah.
Do you really want to risk your PER because you thought it was okay to skip a step? That's what I say about that. Jessica, there we go. I think we're done. Everybody has hung in there like 5 minutes later. Jessica, go ahead and wrap it up, and we sure appreciate everybody's attendance today.
Yes, thanks.
Especially Caroline's attendance.
Yes, thank you, Laurie and Caroline, for just answering all these questions and staying for a little bit longer. I know we have a lot of questions that did not get answered. I'm seeing questions about SLR and state of the art. So I wanted to mention that we are going to be talking about state of the art in a webinar next month. If you can see our screen, there's going to be a webinar on April 21st, and we'll be continuing this discussion for IVDR PER preparedness, as well in a different webinar on April 7th. So please do join us for those if you enjoyed this webinar. I will be sending out the registration information in an email with the recording and the slides after the webinar is over today. So for anyone who had more questions on the content we discussed today, if we did not get to your question, we'll try to reach out to you afterwards. Otherwise, you can always reach out to Laurie and Caroline using their contact info on the slide. And if you'd like to learn more about Criterion Edge services, you can still get your free appointment with Laurie for joining us today. Our contact information is consult@criterionedge.com. And I just want to lastly remind our attendees, when you sign off, you'll be prompted to fill out a really short 2-question survey. We love to have your feedback, so please let us know how you enjoyed today's discussion. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Laurie and Caroline. Stay safe and have a wonderful day.